Okay, this is the second session of my coding part of the software testing course. And during this session, we're going to introduce new tests and things that you've done in CS Quiz. Since you've seen a numeric array also in that. You know perhaps that since this is going to be a numeric array, it should only allow perhaps integers in its in the array that comes in through the constructor and have some type safety. So let's create new tests and make sure that this class can handle cases where someone sends something into the constructor that is not okay. So let's create another test. Public function test constructor should throw exception on non on strings. I think that is enough. So let's actually void and like that. So let's run again the constructor, and let's say the input now is an array that has a string in it, something like that. Usually I try to have the input as simple as possible. You can see that I used 0, 1, 2, 3. It depends on what I'm trying to test, but usually I try to have it as simple as possible, and perhaps the simplest string is A. So we would expect this to throw an exception. Now I need to learn how to write that test. So let's find testing exceptions, part of the documentation. And just like in you write something like in CS Quiz, you write something like expect exceptions. Let's do that. I would expect invalid argument exception. Perfect, that it's exactly what we want. So we've sent it an array. I think this needs to be called expect deprecation, expect notice, expect errors, assert false. I think it needs to be called before. Let's try this. So now we have a failure, should throw an exception on strings. Let's try testing can be used to learn things also, learn how things work. I think this also worked. That was kind of cool. I wonder how they do that. Yeah, not sure. Cool. So I will call it before, because I think this is sort of setting up the expectation, and this is the exercise in system under test. So we send it, then we want to go to green. So let's do that. Let's go to green, and let's say that simplest way of doing that and still succeeding in all the other cases would be to check position 0. If 0 equals an A, then throw new invalid argument exception, and that become an error instead. There was an error that get average with dataset should return 0. Okay, yeah. No. On an empty array, undefined buffets. Yeah, so when you have the array that this doesn't work. So perhaps something like this. If count of values is larger than 0, should return 2 items. I think every test case is failed now. Parameter must be an array or an object. Yeah, values is nothing right now. Like that. Okay, so that succeeded. Everything okay. So that was green, and it is a stupid test. I think this might work actually if you perhaps little a in ASCII is like 64 or something like that. So now I'm in green, and now we go to refactor. So we do have a duplication here, which is this string is duplicated over here. Normally I would say that you should try to avoid to have string constants duplicated. And in this case there is no really reason for us to have a string constant here in the implementation. So I would say that a fair way of refactoring this would be to change that it could be any string, but sort of I don't have the test to implement that it could be a B or something like that. If I had 2 different test cases for this, where the first one is A, the second one is B or something like that, then I have the I have the tests that allow me to generalize an implementation. Right now I don't have tests enough to generalize an implementation. So I think I'm gonna keep it like that for now, and then add more tests so that it I can't keep that stupid implementations anymore. So we have already learned this, that you can have an average provider. So let's create a string throw exception provider. Let's create one of these. Let's copy this one. Test counters should throw exception on strings. So let's remove on strings, and then instead let's have it like this. Let's see if I can move myself to the other corner and stuff. Throw exception provider. So let's have the first. We only have one. We should have 2 cases, something like that. The first one contain an array with A, should throw on string on first position, something like that. And we don't need, we need input here. We really don't need expected. I think maybe this could be done since we throw exception on that one. And then the second test case is should throw on string on second position. Now on other string at first position. So let's add B here. That was the case. So yeah, so instead of that we get the input like this. And let's see if we got that working. Test constructor should, there was one failure. Yeah, right. So on the array B we failed. Now I'm gonna move myself to this place again. And now I can change the implementation, so it must be any string here, right? This string. something like that. So if we have a string at the first position, and then we run that again, so now I'm in green, commit that. Let's remove let's do some refactoring, so let's remove that one. Throw exception provider. I think this more or less looks okay. Perhaps I should like copy that test case the first time and then done this as a refactoring, but the point here is that you should think of what kind of refactorings do I need to do. Okay, so let's go to red again and let's add yet another test case. So let's say that we put the string at the second position. Okay, let's do the simplest implementation for that. Is string that, or is string position like that, something like this. This is starting to look messy, I know. I think it's all right that it looks messy a bit. Let's run these tests. Yeah, that one should return the first item for single item arrays. Fail. Yeah, we had an error first. Something that test get average should return the first item for single item arrays. Undefined offset. Yeah, so now this doesn't really hold together anymore, so pretty much I need to do a for each loop here, which is fine because I'm trying to go to green and I failed because I have tests that fail. So let's go through the array $A, and let's say that if we keep some of the things, if this is a value string and if it is a string, then we throw an exception. I think this code is probably much simpler than the last one we had with all the... Yeah, fine. Okay, so now we're at green. Let's do some refactorings. I think this looks nice. Does this look nice? Okay. Yeah, pretty fine by me. So let's go to red again. As you see, you don't need to be super strict about refactorings, and don't get hung up on this. The important thing is to think, do I need to do some refactorings? Do I have a duplication somewhere? Perhaps I had some duplications here with the A's and B's and C's and stuff like that. Yeah, that could be a refactoring. Okay, let's add another test case here with another type in the not a string, something else, something a float. We shouldn't have, since we're going to work with integers, we probably want to disallow floats or something like that. Should not allow floats. It says numeric array, but I think integers is a good thing for the greater things. Let's put a simple floating point number instead, and let's run this. And this, you get the error on that one, so let's go to green, and let's just yeah, one could do this. If it's a string or is a float value. Okay, maybe that did it. Yeah, that did it. Let's go to refactoring. Okay, so I have two of these, it's probably better is to check if it's an integer value, if it's not an integer, then let's throw that. Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so now I went from strings, disallowing strings, to disallowing strings and floats, to disallowing everything that is not an integer, which it's a pretty big step. So one could think that maybe I need to do something else here. I should have, I don't know, could we have another type of object, new yeah, exception or something like that. Problem is that right now this is not really allowed in TDD to create this test, and the problem with that is because I already have the implementation, I cannot go to red. So this test succeeded directly. So since I have an implementation that already supports not having objects, since I only allow integers, then this test case is not needed. So try to be careful to not adding test cases that you don't need, that you cannot fail. And yeah, so instead I think that we should add another behavior to our class, and we do that by adding test cases first. So public function new test, and I just copy that one, and I think that this should be the case where the array becomes, or the value that the array has becomes too large. So we get an overflow, the case where we have a too high value somewhere in our array, or that the sum of the values become larger than a floating point can be in PHP. So let's create a test for that. And test should throw error on floating point overflow. I think it's called overflow. Let's Google a bit on that. Okay, so I have found some documentation on floating point numbers and the how large they can be. So pretty much there is a method called isFinite, which will return true if we still are a finite number. So the idea would be to create a test case where we send it big enough number so that it's no longer finite. And it should throw an exception. I think that number overflow exception or something like that. So let's create a test case for that. So let's use PHP max float, and let's predefine constant. So I think a good test could be more or less that we send it max float +1 and then let that, it should be infinite, and then PHP counts everything larger than PHP max float +1 is is infinite. So let's call it that. Should throw exception, but this is invalid argument exception. Should throw on floating point overflow. Yeah, we might not want to send it invalid argument exception. Let's just say exception from the beginning. Let's create some input to this one, and I think it might be fine to we create that array. I don't think that it should throw on the creation of the object, but more that we call get average. So we would expect get average to throw an exception when it's too large. And then let's remove this argument, and since we only have one test case, then we create that. So let's create an array. And what was it called? It was PHP max float. And then 1, I think that could be, should throw an exception on float to point overflow. Fine. And let's try that. And now we get something happened, PHP fatal error, uncorrect parse error. So perhaps I did write something wrong. File loader numeric array test 33. Okay, semicolon. So let's see. There was an error. Should throw error on floating point overflow, invalid argument exception. So it threw an, yeah, that isn't. Why did I get an invalid argument exception? Look, let's just not call these two. See what happens. So just from the input array, I get an invalid argument exception, and I wonder why. And I think, I mean, it must be this one that is called is integer. Yeah, it's an integer. Yeah, right. It's integers that is coming in. So that, of course, PHP int max, perhaps. Let's see if that int size, int max. So this could be quite interesting, because in order to create this bug, so to speak, in order to get a floating point, then we would need it to send it PHP int max. I think this one should not be a problem, because integers are 32 bits in PHP and floating points are 64 bits. So I think we should have a hard time detecting this, actually. So we failed asserting, so we don't get an exception. We don't throw exception for that right now. So the average, I'm not sure that we can get an exception here, actually. We could probably, like, if we have really many integers, but since they are 32 bits, we won't add up these. So perhaps we need to scrap that test, really. I mean, this is a valid, if you sum up these two values, or even if you sum up these two values, the sum is a valid float, because float can be so super big. And really, I think this is an invalid test, so to speak. We can never go to red in this. It would be an interesting case to try if we could, like, have a really large array with huge numbers in each point. But I don't think that this will work, unfortunately. So let's scrap that test, really. What one could do is that you, instead of dividing the total sum here, you may change your implementation during the refactor phase. So you may do an additional refactoring on the last refactor phase, where you do something like this. So instead of dividing the total sum, we can divide each value by the number of items, and then we could never get this this error in this, and it should still pass all tests. So you can always like work with your code and do additional refactorings should you like. Okay, I think that was it for the numeric array. So now we have that class, and in the next video we perhaps should add another class that perhaps solves further of the problem that we originated wanted to solve. But let's do that in a future video.